Ukraine attacking Russia in one of Kyiv's largest aerial attacks of the war. Local authorities say at least 6 people were killed in the attacks. Russia says it shot down more than 800 Ukrainian drones overnight, nearly 200 of those in the Moscow region. Ukraine is increasingly firing at targets deep within Russia, including warehouses Kyiv claims are supplying the Russian military. Russia firing back at Kyiv overnight with a mix of drones and missiles. Ukraine's Air Force says it did not shoot down any of the ballistic missiles, again highlighting Ukraine's short supply of missile interceptors. And we are joined now by CNN military analyst, retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. Colonel Leighton, what do you read into Ukraine's strategy here in launching these massive attacks while their own defense is hampered by this shortage of interceptors?
Yeah, Brian, good to be with you. One of the things that is critical here with the Ukrainian effort is they're trying to saturate the Russian air defense and missile defense systems. So the sheer number of drones that they're sending, those 800 that the Russians say they intercepted, that, of course, is a percentage of what was actually sent. And what that shows is that the Russians, yes, they do have some anti-drone capabilities, absolutely, but there are drones that are getting through. And basically what you're seeing here is the Ukrainians are going after a certain set of targets that are designed to hamper Russia's war effort. They know they can't defeat Russia on the ground, but they can defeat Russia, or at least move it to a stalemate in the air and in the drone war. And the drone war has basically taken over almost every aspect of this war, with the exception of what's going on in the Eastern Front. The drone war is really one of the most important aspects. And what that shows is that the Ukrainians have at least been able to not only take the war to certain areas of Russia, they've also impacted the supply chain that the Russians have for their war effort. And that has had some significant issues.
Okay, so it sounds like what you're saying is that Ukraine is trying to make Russia choose defense over offense to some extent in the air. Knowing Ukraine, however, has this shortage of missile interceptors, how does that influence Russia's strategy?
So what Russia is going to do is they're going to use as many ballistic missiles as they possibly can. They know that the Ukrainians don't have the Patriots. They don't have other systems that would potentially intercept any ballistic missiles that they are sending. The Russians have an advantage in this, obviously. Plus, they're also targeting civilian infrastructure. So they're doing things on several fronts. They want to overwhelm the Ukrainian missile defenses, which they're obviously doing a pretty good job of. They're also trying to prevent the West, the U.S. included, from sending missiles of the Patriot variety and similar varieties to Ukraine. And that, of course, makes a big difference as well. So what the Russians are trying to do is overwhelm the Ukrainians and attack civilian infrastructure. The Ukrainians are in a situation where they have few defenses, but they are also punching back in a different area. And that is an effort to throw the Russians off balance.
And quickly, Colonel, on this point, how does these dynamics that we're talking about here impact the front lines of the war with these attacks deep into each other's territories?
So the impact is not discernible in many areas on the front line right now, because what you see on the Eastern Front is basically stasis. In other words, the front line has been frozen to a large extent. There is some movement around Konstantinivka, which is a town in the Donbas region. Mm-hmm. The Russians are trying to take that, but so far they have not succeeded. And that, of course, is important as well. So in essence, we have a stalemate on the ground, but the air war and the drone war really is continuing at this point.
Which would mean that this war would drag on further if the front lines aren't moving. Is that correct?
Yeah, to a large extent. Now, of course, there's also an economic aspect to this, okay. And the Russians are impacted by a lot of the sanctions. Plus, they also have limitations when it comes to the number of troops that they can send. They're getting more North Korean troops in, about 50,000 potentially, mm-hmm. That could be on the front line there, and that, of course, does make for a potential difference there. But the Russians will probably fight for as long as Putin wants them to fight, and that, of course, is going to be the deciding factor at this point.
Russia is currently assessing the damage following one of Ukraine's largest aerial attacks of the war so far. A mall in the Russian-controlled Donetsk region suffered extensive damage, which authorities have blamed on Ukraine. It's reportedly the third Russian mall to be hit this week alone. And this video is showing some smoke rising from a burning medical supplies warehouse near Moscow. In total, the Kremlin says that it shot down more than 800 Ukrainian drones overnight. At least 187 of those were said to have been intercepted over the Moscow region. But Russia has also continued firing on Ukraine. President Zelensky says that Russia has launched more than 1,500 drones, 1,500 guided bombs, and 62 missiles over the past week. The Kremlin's latest attack on Sunday hit a book market in Kyiv, among other sites. For more on all of this, I'm joined by CNN's Sebastian Shukla, who's following the latest out of Berlin. Hey, Sebastian.
Good morning, Paolo. What we're seeing as these trades of airstrikes continue almost unabated every night is that just this last night, Paolo, we've seen Moscow and Kyiv trade attacks. Ukraine has attacked the Belgorod region. It's a neighboring region of Ukraine on the Russian side of the border. And equally, Russia has attacked Sumy, a borderland region of Ukraine too. And unfortunately, in both of those situations, there have been fatalities as well as casualties. You alluded to that enormous attack, the largest ever, according to Russia, that was launched by the Ukrainians across Russia, but largely focused on Moscow. This is a phase of the war now that we have been in for considerable weeks, if not months, and it shows no signs of abating, because the way that this war is now developed, it is now being fought almost predominantly in the skies. The battlefields in eastern Ukraine have ground pretty much to a halt, and both sides have identified weaknesses in each other. That means that air attacks, like we've been seeing through ballistic missile attacks, through drone attacks, and through cruise missiles, is that these are the areas where they think they can inflict the most damage. The Ukrainians, who have developed enormously their drone capabilities, now have the opportunity and chances to be able to hit Russia where it really hurts. And we have seen the range of targets that they've been hitting. They've hit oil refineries, they've hit supermarkets, they've even been hitting warehouses of the Russian equivalent of Amazon, known as Wildberries, because what the Ukrainians say is that that company is supplying weapons or parts and components for the Russian war machine. The converse side of that is that Moscow has also identified that Kyiv and Ukraine have weaknesses, and those weaknesses are largely centered around Ukraine's ballistic, anti-ballistic missile capabilities, namely those Patriot missile interceptors, which are so depleted right now in Ukrainian stockpiles that they have to be sparing about where and when they use them. And the Ukrainian president has been calling for weeks now for an increase in those PAC-2, PAC-3 interceptor missiles, as what they're known in the military jargon, that they desperately need, but they are in such finite supply because they are only produced in the United States. And obviously producing a missile or an anti-ballistic missile like that is not something that you just roll out in the space of a few hours or even a few days. And what the Ukrainian president is calling for now, and I quote here, is that for the European allies and their Patriot missile systems and missiles not to sit idly in storage. These European allies, who are essentially now footing the bill for Ukraine when it is able to procure weapons, have to go through a mechanism that works with NATO called Pearl, which effectively procures missiles from the US. The European allies, they pay, and then they transfer them to Ukraine. The European allies do have these systems as well, but obviously they are slightly more reticent to give over their stockpiles for want of potentially needing them themselves, at this symbiotic balance that's going on here, Paolo. But what I think that we will not see is a real change in this air war. If anything, we will likely to see it. We will continued attacks, and the number of casualties and fatalities will continue to rise, because largely there is no incentive here for Vladimir Putin to end this war yet. He shows no signs of doing so, and part of the way that the Europeans want to try to force him to the negotiating table, particularly as the White House and President Trump does not seem to be making any headway there, is the introduction of another sanctions package, which the Allies really believe, and the Europeans particularly firmly believe, will really start to clip the coffers of the Kremlin to be able to reduce their capabilities to procure money, which is then goes into funneling to buying weapons, paying military contracts, etc., etc. This sanctions package is due to be presented in the next few weeks, and hopefully then will be passed at the next European Council. But even then, that does not mean, Paolo, that we're going to immediately see Vladimir Putin saying, okay, you've got me on another sanctions package, I'm going to look to sue for peace. It shows at the moment, it does not feel that there is any reason, and there is certainly no sign of him looking to sue for any sort of peace. Paolo.
It's been already over a month since President Trump surprised President Zelensky, telling him that he was willing to offer those licenses to the Ukrainians to manufacture, and here they are, still waiting. Sebastian Shukla, thank you so much for laying all that out.